December 19th, 1944. 2:47 a.m. 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. Colonel Oscar Koch sat alone in the dimly lit intelligence office, surrounded by maps covered in red grease pencil marks. Outside, snow fell steadily over eastern France. Inside, Koch's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the latest decrypt from Ultra, the Allies' most closely guarded secret. The message confirmed what he'd been warning about for 3 weeks. The Germans were coming. In 6 hours, General George S. Patton would stand before Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower and predict the impossible. That Third Army could disengage from its current offensive, pivot 90 degrees north, and relieve the besieged city of Bastogne within 72 hours. It would be called the greatest military maneuver of the war. But the real miracle had happened weeks earlier, in this quiet office, when a modest intelligence officer saw what no one else could see. What neither history books nor Hollywood films adequately explain is why Patton deliberately kept his most valuable asset hidden from the spotlight. Why the general who craved publicity like oxygen never once allowed his intelligence chief to brief Eisenhower directly. Why Koch's name rarely appeared in official reports despite making the predictions that shaped Third Army's greatest victories. The answer reveals something profound about military genius, that Patton understood his own limitations better than anyone realized, and that his greatest tactical achievement wasn't any single battle, but recognizing the one man who could see the future. Oscar Koch was everything Patton was not. Quiet, where Patton was bombastic. Cautious, where Patton was reckless. Academic, where Patton was instinctive. Born in Milwaukee in 1897, Koch had served in World War I as an artillery officer, then spent the interwar years teaching at West Point and the Command and General Staff College. While Patton studied ancient cavalry tactics, Koch studied probability theory and statistical analysis. When Patton took command of 1st Armored Corps in 1941, he inherited Koch as his intelligence officer. Their first meeting was reportedly brief and cold. Patton glanced at Koch's thin frame and wire-rimmed glasses and asked a single question. "Can you tell me where the enemy is?" Koch's response would define their relationship. "Sir, I can tell you where he is, where he's going, and what he'll do when he gets there." It was a promise that would have destroyed a lesser man's career, but Koch had discovered something during his years of study, that German military doctrine was predictable, not because German officers were incompetent, but because they were trained in a system that valued proven methods over improvisation. They attacked from specific formations. They concentrated forces according to mathematical ratios. They followed doctrine even when circumstances suggested flexibility. Koch had created what he called his intelligence estimate, a systematic method of analyzing enemy capabilities and intentions. Every morning at 0700, Koch briefed Patton on enemy dispositions, strength, and probable actions. These weren't guesses. They were predictions based on pattern analysis, signal intelligence, prisoner interrogations, and a deep understanding of German military culture. What made Koch extraordinary wasn't just his accuracy. It was his willingness to tell Patton things the general didn't want to hear. North Africa, March 1943, El Getter. Patton was convinced the Germans would attack his southern flank. Koch's morning estimate predicted an attack from the north, through a valley Patton considered impractical for armor. The two men argued for 20 minutes, voices rising, staff officers backing nervously toward the door. Finally, Koch said something no one else would dare. "General, you asked me where the enemy is and what he'll do. I've told you. If you choose not to believe me, that's your decision. But don't ask me to change my estimate to match your hopes." The room went silent. Officers who'd served with Patton knew that tone usually preceded an explosion. Instead, Patton stared at Koch for 10 seconds, then picked up the phone and ordered 2 tank destroyer battalions moved north. The German attack came exactly where Koch predicted, at exactly the strength he'd estimated, using exactly the tactics he'd outlined. It was repulsed with heavy German losses. Afterward, Patton called Koch to his tent and poured him a glass of cognac, something he'd never done for any subordinate. "Oscar," he said quietly, "I'm going to make you a promise. I'll question your estimates. I'll argue with you, but I'll never ignore you again." It was a promise Patton kept for the rest of the war. What Patton understood, what separated him from every other Allied general, was that Koch's value lay not in confirming what Patton believed, but in forcing him to see what he'd missed. Patton's genius was operational. He could see opportunities for exploitation that other commanders couldn't imagine. But he was constitutionally incapable of patience, of waiting for the enemy to reveal himself. Koch provided the one thing Patton's brilliance lacked: restraint. The partnership worked because Patton never tried to make Koch into something he wasn't. While other generals demanded intelligence officers who would present optimistic assessments, Patton wanted the unvarnished truth. He understood that in war, pleasant lies killed soldiers, while unpleasant truths saved them. But Patton also understood something else, that Koch's effectiveness depended on remaining invisible. In Sicily, July 1943, Third Army captured Palermo in a lightning drive that stunned both allies and enemies. Correspondents swarmed Patton, demanding to know how he'd predicted the Italian collapse. Patton gave them what they wanted: stories of aggressive reconnaissance, bold gambles, and intuitive leadership. He never mentioned Koch's estimate predicting that Italian units would disintegrate after 3 days of sustained pressure. He never mentioned that the bold gamble was actually a calculated risk based on Koch's analysis of Italian morale reports. When reporters asked to interview Third Army staff, Patton steered them toward operations officers who would discuss tactics and logistics. Koch remained in the shadows, unknown to anyone outside Third Army headquarters. This wasn't modesty. It was operational security of the highest order. Patton had realized something crucial. If the Germans knew that Third Army possessed an intelligence officer who could predict their movements with uncanny accuracy, they would change their patterns. They would introduce deception. They would alter their doctrine. Koch's effectiveness depended on German commanders never knowing he existed. There was another reason, one Patton never articulated, but that his actions revealed. If Koch became famous, other generals would try to steal him. Eisenhower would assign him to Supreme Headquarters. Bradley would demand him for 12th Army Group. The War Department would promote him to general and give him a theater-level position. Keeping Koch obscure kept him with Third Army. The system Patton and Koch developed was brutally effective. Every evening at 1800, after the daily operations meeting, Patton met privately with Koch for what they called the enemy conference. No one else attended. No minutes were recorded. For 30 minutes, Koch would present his analysis of German intentions, and Patton would test every assumption, challenging every conclusion. Why do you think they're reinforcing that sector? Because their doctrine requires a 3-to-1 ratio for offensive operations, and they're currently at 2-to-1. What if the prisoner we captured was lying? Then his lies match the lies from 3 other prisoners captured in different sectors, which suggests either truth or a deception plan so sophisticated it exceeds German capability. These sessions weren't briefings. They were intellectual combat, with Patton deliberately adopting the devil's advocate position to stress test Koch's conclusions. Staff officers dreaded these meetings because the raised voices suggested conflict. What they didn't understand was that this was how both men thought best, by arguing. The relationship reached its apex in December 1944, during what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. On December 9th, 10 days before the German offensive, Koch presented an estimate that contradicted every other intelligence assessment in the European theater. Ultra-intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and reconnaissance reports all suggested German weakness. First Army intelligence predicted no major German offensive capability. British intelligence concurred. Even Eisenhower's headquarters dismissed concerns about German offensive potential. Koch's estimate stated flatly, "The enemy is capable of a major offensive effort in the Ardennes sector within 2 weeks." He based this on pattern analysis that others ignored. German radio silence in specific sectors suggesting concentration rather than weakness, movement of SS Panzer divisions from the Eastern Front, units that would only be committed for a major operation. Fuel stockpiling detected through mundane logistics reports that other analysts dismissed as routine. Most damning was his analysis of German psychology. "They're desperate," Koch told Patton. "Desperate men take desperate gambles. Everything in their doctrine points toward one last major offensive before winter makes operations impossible." Patton believed him, but when Patton tried to present Koch's estimate at Bradley's headquarters, he was dismissed as alarmist. When he requested permission to halt Third Army's offensive into the Saar and establish defensive positions, Bradley refused. Supreme Headquarters believed the war would be over by Christmas. Planning for a German offensive seemed defeatist. So Patton did something extraordinary. Without orders, without authorization, he instructed his operations staff to develop contingency plans for a 90-degree pivot northward. 3 separate plans, each designated by a compass direction. Patton didn't tell Bradley. He didn't tell Eisenhower. He simply told his staff to be ready. When the Germans attacked on December 16th, creating a 50-mile bulge in American lines and threatening the entire Allied position in France, chaos erupted at Supreme Headquarters. First Army was in retreat. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun on December 19th. Patton arrived at that meeting with 3 complete operational plans in his briefcase, each developed from Koch's December 9th estimate. When Eisenhower asked how quickly Third Army could disengage and move north, other generals estimated 2 weeks. Patton said 72 hours. The room erupted in disbelief. It was operationally impossible. Third Army was engaged with German forces along a 100-mile front. Disengaging required withdrawing units, reorganizing supply lines, and moving hundreds of thousands of men through winter weather on icy roads, then attacking in a completely different direction against fresh German forces.
Patton simply opened his briefcase and handed Eisenhower 3 operational plans, complete with movement tables, supply schedules, and attack timelines. "We can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd, he said. "Which plan would you prefer?" The silence was absolute. Every general in the room realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Patton hadn't predicted the German attack. He'd prepared for it 10 days in advance. Eisenhower selected the plan attacking toward Bastogne. Patton stood, saluted, and left the room. 72 hours later, elements of Third Army broke through German lines and relieved Bastogne. It was called a miracle. It was actually the result of Koch's December 9th estimate and Patton's trust in that estimate. What almost no one knew, what remained classified for decades, was that Patton had committed an act of insubordination that could have ended his career. He'd diverted resources, developed unauthorized plans, and positioned his army for an operation he had no orders to execute, all based on one intelligence officer's estimate that contradicted Supreme Headquarters. If Koch had been wrong, Patton would have been relieved of command. But Koch was never wrong. After Bastogne, Bradley privately asked Patton how he'd known. Patton's response was characteristically theatrical. "I'm a goddamn clairvoyant." He never mentioned Koch. Even in his personal diary, Patton attributed the prediction to instinct and reading the enemy's mind. This wasn't ego, it was protection. If Bradley or Eisenhower knew that one intelligence officer had predicted the Bulge when theater-level intelligence had missed it completely, they would demand to know why their intelligence chiefs had failed. Investigations would follow. Koch would be reassigned. The machine that Patton and Koch had built would be dismantled. So Patton took the credit and let history remember him as a lucky genius. Koch remained in the shadows, filing his daily estimates, briefing his general in private, invisible to everyone who mattered. The pattern repeated through the rest of the war. When Third Army drove deeper into Germany faster than any other Allied formation, correspondents credited Patton's aggressive leadership. Koch's estimates, predicting exactly where German resistance would collapse and where it would stiffen, went unmentioned. When Third Army liberated more territory with fewer casualties than comparable formations, historians attributed it to Patton's tactical brilliance. Koch's intelligence preparation, which allowed Patton to avoid German strongpoints and exploit weaknesses, remained classified. There were moments when the facade nearly cracked. In April 1945, after Third Army captured Kassel, a war correspondent interviewed staff officers and somehow discovered Koch's existence. He wrote a feature story describing the unknown colonel who sees the future. Patton killed the story, personally calling the correspondence editor and threatening to revoke Third Army press credentials. The story never ran. After Germany surrendered, Eisenhower wanted to promote Koch to brigadier general and assign him to occupation headquarters. Patton blocked it, arguing that Koch was essential to Third Army operations, even though operations had ended. The real reason was simpler. Patton had promised Koch that he would never be turned into a show horse, never be paraded before politicians and reporters, never be forced into the spotlight that Patton himself craved but knew Koch despised. Koch retired as a colonel in 1946. No parade, no medal ceremony, no farewell tour. He simply submitted his paperwork and returned to teaching, first at West Point, then at Georgetown University. His lectures on intelligence analysis became legendary among intelligence professionals, but he never discussed his service with Patton. When students asked about the Battle of the Bulge, he would say only that competent intelligence work requires systematic analysis and honest reporting. Patton died in December 1945, killed in a traffic accident in Germany. Among his personal effects was a letter, sealed and addressed to Koch. It was never made public, but Koch's family later revealed a single line. "Oscar, you were right every time. I just made it look good." The tragedy is that history remembers Patton as a cavalryman who relied on instinct and aggression, when in truth he was a general who understood that victory required intelligence as much as courage. The genius wasn't in Patton's bold moves. It was in his recognition that boldness without accurate intelligence was suicide, and that the best intelligence came from an officer who would tell him unpleasant truths. Why did Patton keep Koch in the shadows? Because effectiveness in war isn't about recognition. It's about results. Because a visible intelligence officer is a compromised intelligence officer. Because stealing credit from a subordinate is acceptable if it protects that subordinate's effectiveness. Because Patton understood that some weapons are more valuable when the enemy doesn't know they exist. In 1974, Oscar Koch was interviewed by Army historians. They asked why he thought Patton never publicly acknowledged his contributions. Koch's response was pure intelligence analysis. "General Patton understood that my value lay in being underestimated. If the enemy knew Third Army possessed accurate intelligence, they would adapt. If other generals knew, they would demand similar capabilities we couldn't replicate. If reporters knew, they would ask questions that couldn't be answered. General Patton kept me in the shadows for the same reason submarines operate underwater. That's where they're most effective." Today at the National Archives, Koch's daily intelligence estimates sit in boxes, declassified, but largely unstudied. They reveal a pattern of prediction so accurate it seems impossible. German unit movements forecast days in advance. Enemy intentions stated with certainty. Operational plans anticipated before German commanders issued orders. Military intelligence schools now study Koch's methods as the foundation of modern intelligence analysis. But they teach the techniques, not the man. They explain the system, not the relationship that made it effective. The formulas and frameworks are taught to new generations of intelligence officers, but the human element, the relationship between commander and analyst, built on brutal honesty and mutual respect, remains harder to replicate. The real lesson of Koch and Patton isn't about intelligence gathering or tactical planning. It's about leadership, about recognizing that your own strengths require complementary strengths in others, about protecting subordinates by letting them work in obscurity, about understanding that credit is worthless if it compromises effectiveness, about having the wisdom to value truth over affirmation, accuracy over optimism. Patton's contemporaries saw a general obsessed with glory, a man who named operations after himself and posed for photographers at every opportunity. What they missed was that this same general deliberately obscured his greatest advantage. While other commanders hoarded credit, Patton deflected attention from the one subordinate who made his victories possible. It was an act of leadership that contradicted everything in Patton's public persona, yet revealed his deepest understanding of warfare. Koch's predictions weren't prophecy. They were the product of systematic methodology applied with ruthless discipline. He studied captured German field manuals until he could recite doctrine from memory. He tracked unit movements on maps that covered entire walls. He interviewed every prisoner personally when possible, asking questions designed to reveal not what prisoners knew, but what their knowledge gaps indicated about German planning. He read intelligence summaries from other armies and looked for the patterns they'd missed. Most importantly, Koch understood that intelligence work required intellectual honesty that bordered on the brutal. He couldn't afford to tell Patton what the general wanted to hear. He couldn't shape estimates to support predetermined conclusions. Every morning's briefing had to reflect reality as accurately as human analysis could determine, even when that reality contradicted operational plans, strategic assumptions, or the general's instincts. This relationship, built over 3 years of combat across 2 continents, represented something rare in military history: a commander humble enough to value the truth over ego, and an intelligence officer courageous enough to deliver it. The daily arguments in Patton's office weren't conflicts. They were the stress testing of assumptions, the refining of analysis through challenge and defense. Both men understood that lives depended on getting it right. Patton kept Koch in the shadows because that's where Koch was most dangerous to the enemy. And Patton understood that winning wars was more important than winning glory. The general who loved publicity gave his most valuable officer invisibility as a gift, protection, and a weapon. That's the genius history missed. Not the bold attacks, not the aggressive maneuvers, not the theatrical personality, but the quiet recognition that the best intelligence officer in the European theater was more valuable, unknown than famous, more effective in shadow than in spotlight. Oscar Koch saw the future. George Patton made sure the enemy never knew. And in that deliberate obscurity, Third Army found its greatest weapon: an intelligence officer whose predictions shaped the war's outcome while remaining invisible to history. The partnership between Patton and Koch represents one of warfare's enduring paradoxes, that the most effective weapons are often those the enemy doesn't know exist. Koch's estimates gave Patton an advantage no amount of tanks or artillery could match: certainty in an uncertain environment, knowledge of enemy intentions before those intentions became actions. The records that survive, buried in archives and classified files, tell a story that Hollywood never captured: of daily briefings where an intelligence officer contradicted a commanding general and lived to brief again the next morning. Of victories attributed to aggressive leadership that were actually products of careful preparation. When Koch died in 1982, his obituary in the New York Times ran 6 paragraphs. It mentioned his World War II service in a single sentence. No mention of the Battle of the Bulge, no mention of Patton. He died as he'd lived, in the shadows, unknown to the public. Patton kept Koch in the shadows, because shadows are where intelligence officers do their best work. Because winning wars requires understanding that not all weapons shine in the light.